There are many resources available to so-called minorities in the United States. Very few of those resources are being utilized by the black American people. Mostly is because a lot of black American people don't even know these resources exist. There's an organization created by Richard Nixon called the Minority Business Development Administration, which actually the SBA came from it, but it was created to help so-called minority businesses. This organization has a chapter in every state in the United States. They never advertise or make themselves known to the black people. And the definition of a minority, according to the United States, doesn't specifically mean black people. It just means anybody that's not a white man or just not a heterosexual white man is a minority. So these resources are made available to people who had nothing to do with the civil rights movement, many of whom didn't even try to help in the civil rights movement, like the Asians and the East Indians. Yet they are the biggest beneficiaries next to white women of the civil rights movement, affirmative action. And most of the minority resources goes to them. But I think a lot of black people, we need to actually create a catalog, a brochure listing all of these resources and be the first ones to actually apply for these resources when it comes to economics, when it comes to business loans, business grants, scholarships, whatever. Every resource available to the so-called minorities should go to the black American people first. But because a lot of us don't know about these programs, and when we do find out about these programs and call them up, they tell you, oh, there's nothing available because those resources has been exhausted. You have African people, all of the other groups of people have like networks knowing exactly when to apply for these resources, and then they all apply at once to make sure that they get approved before the black people, and they are actually getting all of these resources. And a person who worked for the United States, no, in the Chicago government, told me that East Indian people, Indian American people, are actually applying for American Indian resources that should go to like American Indians, but because they have the same name, Indian American, American Indian, they're going to court and actually winning cases. When people actually say you shouldn't have got those resources that's supposed to go to American Indians, the judge is agreeing with the Indian Americans, and they actually are getting resources that is allocated to American Indians, and most people don't even know that. But the black American people should go and apply for all of these resources available. Like in Chicago, you go to the city colleges, they have something called Future Ready, which they giving out free tuition if you get a certificate. It could be in carpentry, plumbing, electrical, mechanic, whatever. If it's a certificate program, they're giving out free tuitions. Now, a lot of the people taking advantage of that is Hispanics, Mexicans, because they're considered minorities. But the black people need to apply for all of this. Whatever the government have for minorities, all of the black people should go and look for it and apply for it. Because if you don't, it's going to go to somebody who had nothing to do with slavery, nothing to do with the civil rights movement, who had nothing to do with lynching. Who actually, most of these immigrant people, especially East Indians and Chinese people, were lobbying the government to consider them white because they weren't considered white in the early 1900s, and really they couldn't even come. Chinese people couldn't even come to the United States because they was considered, they had the Chinese Exclusion Act. But once they got rid of the Chinese Exclusion Act, they were considered colored. It's a book I read called The Invention of the White Race. And they didn't talk about this, but the coolie trades, most people don't even know about the coolie trades. The coolie trades was when Great Britain was going to India and China after slavery was abolished in America, they was taking Indian and Chinese people from the Qing dynasty, and then Britain controlled, like Queen Victoria was the Empress of India. They was bringing all of these people to South America, Middle America, Central Mexico. Like most of the Mexicans are actually Chinese and Indian people. Jamaica, all the islands, all the British territories, it was bringing Chinese and Indian people by the droves. And America had a law in the U.S. Code of what's it called? They didn't participate in the coolie trades. It said the coolie trades was abolished in the United States. So Chinese and Indian people were allocated to these small little sections. They weren't allowed to come here because they weren't considered white. They were considered colored. And the Chinese they had the Total Exclusion Act because Britain was just bringing them by the millions. And most of these people calling themselves Latinos now are actually East Indians. That's why Kamala Harris' family is Indian, because they brought them to Jamaica. Most of them are actually Indians. But a lot of these people that came from South America in this book called The Invention of the White Race, they were allowed to get a certificate of whiteness, the Chinese and the East Indian people. But when they brought that certificate to the United States, they never accepted it because they said, you're not white, you're colored. And the Chinese and the East Indians, for like 100 years, even the Latinos were trying to be considered white, and they always got rejected. After the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Immigration Reform Act of 1965, the East Indians and Chinese wanted to separate themselves as minorities from blacks. They wanted their own separate distinction. And I think in 1981, they achieved it, and they got the status of Indian Asian because they didn't want to just be seen as just a minority. They Indian Asian, and the black people never got a distinction. So we just consider just minority with nothing else. To this very day, they don't recognize just so-called African, nothing. But the Asian Indian people got their own status, and they still get the minority money. They still looking for the money that they had nothing to do with. While they was lynching blacks in America, these Chinese and East Indians was trying to be seen as white. The Latinos was considered white, but they never let the East Indians and Chinese get that white status, but they settled for their own status, Asian Indian. And the Indians are now the East Indians because the Indian people are not even Indian. They was given that name by the British. I think Queen Victoria called them India because she was the Empress of India, but they was called Hindus. They're taking advantage of the fact that they got that Indian name from Britain and using it to get the American Indian resources. And blacks are sitting back getting nothing. Most black people is getting none of the resources because a lot of us are not applying. Nobody is telling us about the resources. So you have to actually do the research to figure out what is available to these so-called minorities. And then we have to tell these Negro congressmen that we keep voting for to give us our own separate distinction as a so-called minority. Because as it stands now, there is nothing specific for blacks when it comes to the civil rights movement. And this is what they told me when I called up the Minority Business Development Association that was started by Richard Nixon in 1971. They said there is nothing specific for blacks. You just a minority. They have specifics for women, which is white women, Asian, Indians. They have the specifics for everybody except the blacks. So therefore, they could actually exhaust all the resources, give nothing to the blacks, and it doesn't matter because we're not considered a separate group. We're just in the minority mix. So they could just exclude us totally, and there's no outrage because they don't have to document that blacks got nothing because blacks are not seen as a separate minority group. And most people don't even know that. The Black Caucus, the caucus, hasn't even wrote a law. They could write a bill. Anybody could write a bill saying that the blacks should get their own individual status. So when it comes to tabulating whoever got the resources, you will say this particular group got nothing. How they do it now, they say minorities as a whole got something. So they're going to assume that meant blacks, but it doesn't. It doesn't. So this video is about, I think the blacks should take advantage of all of the resources. All of the resources should go to the blacks. The other groups deserve nothing. They deserve, because they have done nothing. They have contributed nothing. They didn't go through none of the struggle. They didn't even participate in the civil rights movement. They were trying to be considered white, but they were sicking dogs and lynching blacks. So they deserve nothing. And the Africans wasn't even allowed to come to America until 1965. None of them deserve nothing. But as it stands now, they're getting everything by default. But yeah, the blacks should apply for all available resources and write a bill. We all can write a bill and send that bill to the Negro congressmen to get a vote, to get our own status separate from all these other groups. Or we could write a bill to repeal the Civil Rights Act and have it written there that this is only for the blacks, the Negro, nobody else. But nobody is writing these bills, and everybody else taking advantage of all of the resources. But that's about it though.